This move immediately fights for central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for many common and dynamic opening systems. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a dynamic and asymmetrical response that immediately challenges white's central pawn and creates imbalanced pawn structures, leading to complex strategic battles. This move establishes the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, preparing to develop the bishop to e7 and castle kingside, while also allowing for the possibility of a nc6 development. This move initiates the open Sicilian, directly challenging black's pawn center and aiming to open lines for rapid development and piece activity. This capture correctly opens the center for black, leading to a typical Sicilian defense structure where both sides will contest control of key central squares and files. This move develops a knight to a central outpost, challenging black's control of the d4 square and preparing for further development. Typical of the open Sicilian, this move develops a knight towards the center while simultaneously attacking white's central pawn, preparing to challenge control of the d5 square and often leading into Najdorf or classical variations of the Sicilian defense. This move, f4, intensifies the central battle and aims to support the d4 pawn while preparing to launch a kingside attack, a common strategy in many variations of the Sicilian defense, particularly the accelerated dragon or Richter Rouser. This move maintains the tension in the center, typical of the Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian defense, by keeping both knights developed and ready to contest key central squares. This move prepares to support the d6 pawn and potentially develop the queen to a more active central square. Developing the bishop to d3 prepares for kingside castling and supports the central pawn structure, while also controlling key central squares. This move develops the knight to a natural square, preparing to castle and reinforcing the d5 outpost, a typical plan in the classical Sicilian. Castling kingside securely tucks the king away from the center and prepares to connect the rooks, while also bringing the rook closer to the e-file where white aims to develop an advantage. This move initiates a thematic pawn thrust in the Sicilian Najdorf, aiming to gain queenside space and potentially create play against white's king by opening the b-file. This move prepares to transpose into an English attack setup within the Sicilian Najdorf, offering a flexible approach to controlling the center and potentially launching a kingside attack. This move prepares to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the central pawn structure and potentially eyeing the queenside expansion. The knight's repositioning to h4 prepares for aggressive play on the kingside, potentially targeting the f6 knight or creating attacking opportunities with the g3 pawn push. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop, aiming to control the long dark squared diagonal and reinforce the kingside defenses against white's aggressive pawn push on the kingside. White retreats the knight to f3, reinforcing the center and preparing to potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square, while avoiding commitment to the complex e5 pawn push. Developing the bishop to the active g7 square prepares to castle kingside, completing black's initial development and aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure with the bishop's long-range influence. This move redeploys the queen to a more active diagonal, aiming to coordinate with the knight on f3 and potentially target black's kingside or prepare further pawn advances. Castling on the kingside solidifies the king's safety, centralizes the rook, and prepares for potential kingside pawn advances while white's queen is somewhat exposed on h4. This move strategically exchanges pawns to open the f-file, creating attacking possibilities against black's kingside and potentially activating white's rook. This capture maintains central pawn tension and opens lines for your pieces, preparing to challenge white's central control. This move aims to exchange white's light squared bishop for black's dark squared bishop, weakening black's kingside pawn structure and potentially creating attacking opportunities on the dark squares. This move develops the knight to a more active square, eyeing the weak dark squares around white's king and preparing for potential counterplay. This exchange on the g7 square eliminates black's bishop, which was ideally placed on the long diagonal, disrupting their king's pawn shield and simplifying white's attacking prospects. The king's recapture on g7 is a necessary response to maintain material equality, though it exposes the monarch to increased activity from white's pieces along the g-file and the long diagonal. White establishes central control and prepares to activate the rook on the d-file, anticipating potential pawn breaks or piece play in that sector. This move activates the knight to a more central outpost, potentially eyeing squares like e6 or d5, and challenging white's control of the d-file. The rook on f2 supports potential advances on the kingside and prepares to contest the f-file, which may open after black's knight moves. This move solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the open f-file, while black's knight on h5 now lacks an easy retreat. This move centralizes the rook, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support a d5 pawn advance or join the attack. On the kingside, this move develops a piece to a more active central square, contesting the d7 gram4 diagonal and preparing to challenge white's d-file control. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the d7 pawn and preparing to support potential pawn advances on the kingside or queenside. This move initiates a queenside pawn thrust to disrupt white's central control and open lines for black's pieces. This move boldly challenges black's central control and aims to exploit the open d-file and potentially disrupt black's kingside pawn structure. This move aims to simplify the position and eliminate white's strong knight on d5, which was exerting significant pressure on black's queenside and central squares. This pawn capture on d5 opens the e-file, creating attacking chances for white's rook while also challenging black's queenside pawn structure, and potentially isolating the d5 pawn. This move continues black's active piece play, challenging white's knight and preparing to exploit the weakened light squares around white's king. The queen repositions to e1, preparing to support a potential kingside advance by the f-pawn and to contest the open e-file with black's queen. This move resolves the tension in the center by trading knights, opening the d-file for white and potentially creating pawn weaknesses for black if white can exploit the doubled pawns later. This recapture on d2 is essential to prevent black's knight from establishing a strong outpost on e3 and also frees the queen to rejoin the fight on the kingside. This move recaptures the pawn and clears the way for black's pieces to become more active, specifically by potentially opening the d-file for the rook and increasing pressure on white's queenside. This move aims to disrupt black's pawn structure on the queenside and create a passed pawn on the c-file, potentially opening lines for white's rooks. Black captures the c-pawn, aiming to open the b-file for their rook and challenge white's central pawn majority by creating connected passed pawns on the queenside.